If you've ever paddled a cedar-strip canoe on a Canadian lake, felt the hull flex beneath you, smelled the varnish warming in the sun, it almost certainly came from the Peterborough Canoe Company. At its peak, the factory on the Otonabee River employed a quarter of every Canadian working in small boat building, producing what were widely regarded as the finest wooden canoes on Earth. They survived 2 world wars, survived a depression and the acquisition of every rival in the country, survived 70 Canadian winters in a brick factory on the Otonabee. And then, in 1961, the factory at King and Water Streets went silent for the last time. How does a company that outlasted everything the 20th century could throw at it simply disappear? What happened on that factory floor? Chapter 1. Nogojiwanong. The Otonabee River drops 144 feet between Kachewanuka Lake and Little Lake, a stretch of white water so fierce that the Mississauga Anishinaabe, who'd lived along its banks for centuries, called the place at the foot of those rapids Nogojiwanong. The river was their highway. The birch bark canoe was the vehicle that made it navigable, light enough to portage around the falls, strong enough to carry a family and its provisions across the interconnected lake system that Europeans would later name the Kawarthas. At Petroglyphs Provincial Park, 35 kilometers northeast of the modern city, rock-pecked images of canoes more than 1,000 years old are still visible in the limestone. The canoe wasn't a recreational object. It was the first technology of the country, the machine that made the interior of the continent accessible to human life. Samuel de Champlain paddled through in 1615. Adam Scott built the first sawmill on Little Lake in 1818. By the 1820s, the place was Scott's Plains, a single-house settlement reached by water. By the 1850s, it was Peterborough, a milling town of sawdust and ambition. And by the 1870s, per the Canadian Encyclopedia, Ontario's principal timber producer, shipping over 236,000 cubic meters of lumber to American wholesalers annually. The Otonabee, choked with sawdust and mill runoff, lost its Atlantic salmon by 1870, the first of many extinctions the river would witness. But the timber that poisoned the river also nourished something. White cedar, Thuja occidentalis, grew thick in the Kawartha cuts north of town, and when it came down the Otonabee to the planing mills, it arrived light, straight-grained, and resistant to rot. It was the perfect boat-building wood, and the shape those boats would take, the low sheer, the tumble-home, the rockered keel, had already been perfected by the Mississauga and their Algonquian forebears over thousands of years of living on these waters. Everything that followed, every patent filed, every factory raised, every canoe shipped to England in a crate stamped with a Peterborough return address, began with that older knowledge. European hands would mechanize the form, but the form was never theirs. Chapter 2. The Man Who Watched a Regatta. In the summer of 1857, a planing mill operator named John Stevenson sat on the shore of Little Lake and watched the annual regatta. Stevenson was 26 years old, Scottish-born, operating a water-powered shop on the east bank of the Otonabee, just north of where the Hunter Street Bridge stands today. He knew wood. He knew what a lathe could do to a piece of basswood, what a steam box could do to a strip of rock elm. What he didn't know, watching from the bank that afternoon, was that he was about to start an industry. The men in the regatta were exhausted, not from paddling, but from portaging. Their boats were heavy basswood dugouts, hollowed from single logs, beautiful in their way but punishing to carry. Stevenson watched them haul those craft up the bank between races and thought the problem through the way a mill worker would. The shape was right, but the material was wrong. You didn't need a solid log. You needed a shell, ribs and planks bent over a form, light enough that one man could carry it at a portage, and strong enough to survive the rapids. He wasn't the first person to think this. The Mississauga had solved the problem centuries earlier with birch bark, a material so light and so brilliantly suited to the task that Europeans had been studying it since Champlain's era. What Stevenson did was translate the indigenous solution into European boat-building language. Plank and rib construction, shaped over a solid wood form that family lore says he may have carved from a hollowed-out dugout. He filed no patent that year. He simply built. By 1858, or 1859, depending on whose grandson you believe, the first Stephenson canoe existed. A white oak keelson, half-round rock elm ribs steam-bent at 4.5-inch centers, basewood wideboard planks fastened with 16-gauge copper nails. 10 kilometers north, in Lakefield, a man named Thomas Gordon was arriving at the same construction independently from 1858, working out the rib and batten method in his own shop. Neither copied the other. Both were watching the same birch bark canoes and asking the same question. The construction itself was a small marvel of repetitive precision. As builder historian Mike Elliott of Kettle River Canoes has documented, a 16-foot canoe required approximately 4,000 copper nails, every one driven by hand and dubbed over, bent flat against the inside of the rib so that no fastener head showed on the exterior hull. A man with a cobbler's hammer and a metal-clad form could drive perhaps 300 nails in a good hour. The rhythm, click, click, click against the form, would become the signature sound of Peterborough boat building for the next century. Stephenson patented improvements as they came: the cedar rib method in 1879, the longitudinal cedar-strip technique in 1883, the construction that would give the Peterborough canoe its global identity. William English added the flush batten patent in 1888, an interior strip covering each butt joint that made the wideboard canoe watertight without visible caulking. Dan Harold patented the double plank method in 1871. These were working-class Canadians in a country barely 20 years old, producing a tradition of patentable engineering that would outperform anything the established boatyards of New England or the Thames Valley could offer. By the 1860s, Peterborough racing canoes were appearing at the regattas on Stony Lake. By the 1880s, they were crossing the Atlantic to compete at American Canoe Association encampments at Lake George and to supply the Royal Canoe Club in London, founded in 1866 by the explorer John MacGregor. Canoe leisure had become a transatlantic upper-middle-class passion, and the lightest, best-finished, fastest cruising canoes in the world were coming out of a small Ontario manufacturing town on a river that still smelled of sawmill runoff. The irony that a Peterborough brochure would later make explicit, positioning its products as direct descendants of the Canadian birch bark canoes that were built and used by the Indians of Ontario's Otonabee Valley, wasn't irony to the men who wrote it. They stated the lineage openly, without embarrassment or compensation. The craft they sold to English gentlemen for use on the Norfolk Broads had been designed by Mississauga paddlers on the Otonabee. The distance between those two uses, a First Nations family navigating rapids and a London solicitor picnicking under willows, was measured not in miles, but in everything the 19th century chose not to examine. Chapter 3. Fire and Founding. The first attempt to industrialize Stephenson's craft was the Ontario Canoe Company, incorporated in 1883 by Colonel James Z. Rogers, a Peterborough businessman with enough capital to lease Stephenson's patents and enough ambition to build a factory around them. Rogers was 41, civic-minded, and deeply embedded in the town's commercial life. His family would eventually connect by blood and business to R.B. Rogers, the engineer who designed the Peterborough lift lock. The Ontario Canoe Company became the first factory in the world dedicated to the mass production of canoes. It lasted 9 years. On the 9th of May, 1892, the Ontario Canoe Company factory burned to the ground. The fire was total. The building was uninsured. Rogers, who had held a 1/3 ownership stake, was financially ruined in a single afternoon. The patents, the trained workforce, the market relationships, all of it survived in the heads and hands of 50-odd craftsmen who walked out of the smoke with nothing but their skills. The factory itself was gone. What happened next defines Peterborough. Within weeks of the fire, 2 new companies rose from the ashes, not metaphorically, but literally within sight of the charred site. The Peterborough Canoe Company was incorporated in 1892 by William H. Hill and Elihu Edwards, local businessmen who understood that the most valuable asset wasn't the building, but the men who'd worked inside it. Rogers, broke but indispensable, took 4% of the new stock and was made manager in 1893. About 50 Ontario Canoe Company craftsmen walked across town to the new shop. A factory complex opened on the 15th of February, 1893, at the corner of King and Water Streets, on the west bank of the Otonabee, with the rail line a block away, and the river itself serving as both water supply and spiritual claim to the canoe tradition. The same year, 1892, a former Ontario Canoe Company supervisor named Arthur Tebb and his partner Felix Brownscombe incorporated the Canadian Canoe Company on Water Street. Two Phoenix companies, born from the same fire, staffed by the same craftsmen, competing for the same market. It was an act of creative destruction so thorough that the town emerged from the ashes with more canoe-building capacity than it had possessed before the fire. And they weren't alone. The competitive cluster that formed in Peterborough and its satellite village of Lakefield between the 1860s and 1900 was the densest small boat building concentration in the British Empire. William English had been building canoes on Charlotte Street since 1861. His high-end flush-batten models were the luxury tier, the canoe you bought when money wasn't the question. Thomas Gordon's Lakefield shop had been operating since 1858. Robert Strickland, son of pioneer Samuel Strickland, nephew of writers Catherine Parr Traill and Susanna Moody, founded the Lakefield Canoe Works in 1892, exporting more than 600 canoes to England in the company's first 6 years through a sales office in West Drayton, Middlesex. J.G. Brown's boat shop had been producing since the 1870s. Half a dozen smaller operations filled the gaps. By 1900, this cluster of shops in a landlocked Ontario county was exporting tens of thousands of canoes to customers across Canada, the United States, and the British Empire. The raw material came down the Otonabee from the Kawartha timber cuts. The finished product went out by rail, and the skills that held the whole enterprise together, the steam bending, the copper nail dubbing, the plank fitting, the varnishing, passed from hand to hand on factory floors, where a 4 to 7 year apprenticeship was the price of admission. Colonel Rogers died in 1909, having rebuilt from ruin and run the Peterborough Canoe Company through its first 16 years. The company passed into the hands of the Richardson family. W.A. Richardson, the secretary-treasurer who had joined Rogers early, and whose descendants would manage the company through every remaining decade of its existence. The Richardsons weren't entrepreneurs in the speculative sense. They were custodians, a family who believed in wood, in the methods their workers had perfected, and in the market that had sustained them. That custodial instinct would hold the company together through 2 world wars and a depression. It would also, in the end, keep it from adapting to the thing that killed it. Chapter 4. The Smell of Cedar. Imagine standing on the factory floor of the Peterborough Canoe Company on a March morning in 1925. The building occupies a substantial industrial block on the west bank of the Otonabee. Brick walls, high windows, the river running past close enough that you can hear it through the planing room wall when the saws stop. The rail siding is a block away. The smell reaches you before the sound does. White cedar shavings. Basswood dust so fine it hangs in the slant of light from the east-facing windows like flour in a bakery. Hot Spanish cedar from the steam boxes, where planks are being softened for bending. A sharp, almost sweet resin scent that clings to your clothes and doesn't leave for days. Over it all, the heavy sweetness of spar varnish, applied in 6 to 8 coats on every interior surface. And underneath, fainter, the metallic tang of hot brass from the dubbing irons, where copper nail heads are being pressed flat inside each rib. The planing room runs the length of the building. White cedar logs that came down the Otonabee from the Kawartha cuts are being planed to 1/4-inch thickness and edge-jointed, the process that transforms a raw log into the ribbon-thin planks a canoe requires. In the steam room behind it, rock elm ribs are soaking in steam boxes 7 feet long, sealed at one end, with a boiler pipe running in from the wall. A man opens the box, pulls a rib with tongs, carries it steaming to the nearest form, and bends it into shape in the 4 or 5 seconds before the wood stiffens. If he's slow, the rib cracks. If he's fast, it curves like a drawn bow and holds. The forms themselves line the center of the main floor. Solid wood molds, each one the negative shape of a specific canoe model, dressed smooth and waiting. The keelson goes in first, laid along the center line. Then the ribs, steam bent over the form and clamped. Then the planks, wide boards for the wide board models, thin strips for the cedar strip, each one placed and fastened with 16-gauge copper nails driven through the plank and rib together. A cobbler's hammer, a metal backing plate on the far side, and the nail bends over flat. Click, click, click. 4,000 times per 16-foot canoe. A skilled nailer could finish a hull in a day, working at a pace that turned his right forearm into something closer to a machine component than a limb. The men doing this work are in white shirts and waistcoats. The early photographs show no overalls, no coveralls, no modern safety equipment of any kind. Aprons, yes. Sleeves rolled to the elbow in summer. The factory is unheated in any modern sense. In January, the cold off the Otonabee seeps through the brick walls, and the men work in layers that a newcomer learns to manage or suffers through. Summer is different. The steam boxes and the varnish room turn the building into something close to a greenhouse, and the windows along the east wall stay open from May to October. At the far end of the floor, the finishing shop. A canoe comes off the form as a bare hull, structurally complete but unfinished. It's scraped, sanded by hand, and dressed. For canvas-covered models, canvas is stretched tight over the hull, filled with a lead and oil compound, a process Chestnut Canoe of Fredericton patented in 1905, sanded smooth and painted. Decks are fitted. Thwarts are bolted. Cane seats are woven and mounted. Then the varnish. Coat after coat of marine spar varnish, each one sanded between applications, until the interior glows with the deep amber warmth that became the visual signature of a Peterborough canoe. A buyer running a hand along the gunnel of a finished model was touching something that had passed through at least a dozen pairs of hands over a period of days. Training for this work wasn't something you picked up in a season. A canoe builder's apprenticeship ran 4 to 7 years, long enough that families passed the trade down like a surname. Walter Walker, who would become one of the most important figures in the craft's survival, would eventually claim 4 different shop tenures: Brown, Peterborough, Rilco, Peel, without ever leaving the trade or the county. The floor was a web of family connections: fathers and sons, brothers, cousins, men who'd married into each other's families and whose children grew up expecting to follow them through the same factory gates. The workforce expanded from roughly 50 at the 1893 opening to several hundred by the 1920s. The most reliable figure comes from Ken Brown's research. In 1930, of the 778 Canadians employed in small boat building nationally, about a quarter, approximately 194, worked in the Peterborough area, with the Peterborough Canoe Company the largest single employer. A quarter of a national industry concentrated in a single landlocked county. Nothing like it existed anywhere else on Earth. Chapter 5. Empire. The Richardsons didn't build an empire by making better canoes. They built it by buying every competitor who made canoes nearly as good. The first major acquisition came in 1915, when the Peterborough Canoe Company absorbed the William English Canoe Company. English himself had died in 1891. The firm had passed through his brother Samuel and partners John Carveth and John Baptiste Odette, and was still producing the high-end flush-batten canoes that English had patented, the luxury tier of the Peterborough cluster. Bringing English inside PCC's walls consolidated the top of the market under one roof. The second was the move that created a national monopoly. In 1923, PCC merged with the Chestnut Canoe Company of Fredericton, New Brunswick, the only builder in Canada of comparable scale. Chestnut had been producing since 1897, and by 1914 was turning out 1,200 canoes annually, making it the largest canoe manufacturer in the British Empire. The merger created a holding company called Canadian Watercraft Limited, with Chestnut and Peterborough as its twin brands, East Coast and Central Canada, Canvas and Cedar-strip, each with its own identity, but under shared ownership. It is widely believed among restorers that after 1923, all canvas canoes sold under the Peterborough brand were actually built at Chestnut's Fredericton factory, with the Peterborough name stamped at distribution. The brand had become a label as much as a place. In 1928, Canadian Watercraft completed the sweep by acquiring the Canadian Canoe Company, the other Phoenix firm that had risen from the 1892 fire. By 1930, the Peterborough Canoe Company was the dominant brand within a trust that controlled most factory-built wooden canoe production in the country. Chestnut, Peterborough, English, Canadian. 4 names, 1 ownership, 1 strategy. The competitive cluster that had once made the Otonabee Valley hum with rival hammers was now a managed portfolio. The product line grew far beyond canoes. The catalogs from the 1920s and 30s list cedar-strip skiffs, motor launches, sailing canoes with brew and radix folding centerboards, war canoes seating 16 paddlers, rowing skiffs, snowshoes, ash and hickory skis, paddles, duck decoys, office fittings, and camping goods. The 1956 catalog alone, large format, 8¼ by 14 inches, runs to pages of model numbers under the 4-digit serial system adopted between 1940 and 1941. The Champlain, the Otonabee, the Cruiser, the Prospector, the Lakeside, the Comfort, the Royal. A buyer in 1930 could outfit an entire Kawartha cottage from a single Peterborough showroom. The export business gave the company its reputation beyond Canada. Canoes shipped to England through dedicated overseas sales offices. The British public, raised on John McGregor's canoe travel books and enchanted by the idea of the Canadian wild, bought Peterborough boats for use on the Norfolk Broads, the Thames, the Lake District. Young English gentlemen paddled cedar-strip canoes in flat water that would have bored a Kawartha guide to tears. But they paddled Peterboroughs, and they told their friends, and the brand entered the vocabulary of British leisure as a synonym for quality. The single most famous order in the company's history arrived in 1947. The city of Peterborough commissioned a 16-foot cedar rib canoe as a wedding gift for Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. The canoe was built by hand, the same construction, the same copper nails, the same varnish, and shipped to Buckingham Palace in time for the November wedding. It was a gesture that positioned Peterborough as a place that could send its best work to a princess, and it positioned the cedar-strip canoe as an object worthy of royalty. Decades later, in May 2006, Prince Andrew, as royal patron of the Canadian Canoe Museum, returned 3 Peterborough-area canoes, including one of the wedding gifts, on long-term loan during a visit marking the museum's 10th anniversary. The context surrounding this rise was the explosion of cottage culture across the Kawartha Lakes. The Trent Severn Waterway, 386 kilometers from Trenton on Lake Ontario to Port Severn on Lake Huron, begun in 1833 and not completed until 1920, had transformed the Kawartha Lakes from a fur trade route into the most important recreational paddling network in Ontario. The Trent Valley Navigation Company branded the region for tourism in the first decade of the century. Tom Thompson drowned from his canoe on Canoe Lake in 1917, an event that became foundational to Canadian wilderness mythology. The Group of 7 painted the shield. The great summer camps were founded: Candelore, Wapameyo, Taylor-Staton. Every waterfront lot with road access was being claimed. And at the center of that expanding universe of Canadian leisure, the Peterborough Canoe Company sat like a heart, pumping cedar-strip boats into the bloodstream of the country's self-image. The canoe was becoming more than a product. Pierre Trudeau, 22 years old, not yet imagining politics, paddled from Montreal up the Ottawa River to James Bay with a classmate in 1941. 3 years later, he wrote his essay declaring that to paddle 100 in a canoe, and you are already a child of nature. Pierre Berton's most quoted line, that a Canadian is someone who knows how to have sex in a canoe, was made literal commerce by PCC's Comfort Craft courting canoe, a 2-seat model with a built-in phonograph that introduced the verb to canoodle to North American slang. The canoe appeared on stamps, on coins, in the paintings of every member of the Group of 7. And the company that put more of those canoes on more of those lakes than any other manufacturer in the country was headquartered in a brick factory on the banks of the Otonabee, staffed by men whose apprenticeship stretched back to techniques John Stevenson had worked out with his hands in 1858. Chapter 6. The Summit. Before the cedar snapped. 1948. Choose that year carefully, and the whole story pivots on it. The hinge between what the Peterborough Canoe Company was and what it was about to become. The Princess Elizabeth wedding canoe had shipped the previous autumn. The company could and did call itself Canada's largest manufacturer of boats. Not canoes, boats. Through the late 1940s and into the 50s. The post-war Kawartha cottage boom was remaking the lakeshores. Every waterfront lot with road access was being developed, and PCC had more orders than its craftsmen could fill. On Monaghan Road, across town, the Canadian Johnson Motor Company, established in Peterborough in 1928 and reorganized under Outboard Marine Corporation in 1936, was assembling Johnson outboard motors in volume. PCC had a supply arrangement with OMC for the engines that powered its new wooden streamliner runabouts. A line of 8 different models, 16-foot hulls with 25 horsepower Johnson Seahorses bolted to the transom, fitted with windshields, remote steering, varnished decks, and the signature red-painted hull bottom. A cedar-strip boat with a Johnson motor on the back. 2 Peterborough companies working together, one hand building the hull and the other supplying the engine. The Richardson family presided over all of it. The line that ran from W.A. Richardson, Secretary-Treasurer under Colonel Rogers, to Jack Richardson, who would one day be the company's last general manager. They'd inherited a woodcraft enterprise, and they believed in wood. Not as a business calculation, as an identity. The factory was cedar. The workforce was cedar. The brand was cedar. The idea that the future might be made of something else wasn't a strategic question the Richardsons were equipped to ask, because asking it would have meant doubting the thing that had made them what they were. But the future was already arriving. Owens Corning had commercialized fiberglass roving in 1942 for wartime aircraft components. By 1948, the first all-fiberglass production boats were appearing in the American market. In Bethpage, Long Island, Grumman Aircraft, the same company that built Hellcats and Avengers for the Pacific War, had found a peacetime use for its surplus aircraft-grade aluminum. Grumman Vice President William Hoffman had proposed the idea in 1944. By 1945, the factory had produced its first canoe, a 13-footer that weighed 30% less than a comparable wooden model. It didn't need canvas. It didn't need varnish. It didn't need 4,000 copper nails. It needed a press, a die, and aluminum. The same material, in the same factory, using the same skills that had built carrier aircraft a year earlier. Nobody on the floor at King and Water Streets felt the tremor. Not yet. The order books were full. The Kawarthas were booming. The princess had a Peterborough canoe in Buckingham Palace. 1948 was the best year the company had ever known. It was also the last year the company could have changed direction and survived. Canadian Watercraft Limited, the holding company that controlled PCC, Chestnut, and the Canadian brand, had no engineering research and development budget comparable to the millions OMC was pouring into motor design across town. The structure was a family trust whose key asset was brand reputation, not technical innovation. Retooling for fiberglass would have meant buying molds, hiring chemists, retraining cedar craftsmen as plastics workers, and abandoning the thing that made Peterborough canoes worth buying in the first place. The Richardsons looked at that calculation and chose what they knew. It was a reasonable decision. It was the decision that every craftsman in the building would have endorsed. And it was the decision that would, in 13 years, leave every one of them without a job. The cedar was still warm. The varnish still glowed under the factory lights. The 4,000th nail was still being driven home by hands that had done it 10,000 times before. But somewhere in Ohio, Owens Corning was shipping fiberglass by the railcar. Somewhere on Long Island, Grumman was stamping aluminum hulls at a rate that would have emptied PCC's entire annual output in a week. And somewhere in a cottage showroom, a young couple who'd grown up paddling cedar was looking at a fiberglass runabout that cost half the price, weighed less, and would never need to be varnished again. The peak had passed. The men on the floor couldn't feel it yet, but the numbers had already changed. Chapter 7. The material that killed the cedar. The economics of fiberglass against cedar strip were not close. They weren't even a contest. A skilled cedar-strip canoe builder, working at the pace the craft demanded. Steam-bending ribs, fitting planks, driving and dubbing 4,000 copper nails, could produce roughly one canoe per worker week. A fiberglass shop using a female plug mold could lay up a hull in hours and pop a finished canoe off the mold the following day. The mold cost money to build. The 20th canoe off that mold cost almost nothing. The 200th cost less. The economics of fiberglass were the economics of reproduction. Make the form once, stamp forever, against the economics of individual craft, where every hull was built from scratch by a man whose hands were the only mold the factory possessed. Aluminum was worse. Grumman's Long Island plant had retooled from Hellcats to canoes without changing its fundamental manufacturing process. Sheet aluminum, formed in a press, riveted along the keel line. The press didn't care whether it was shaping an aircraft fuselage or a 13-foot canoe. It ran at the same speed either way. And the product that came off it didn't need canvas, didn't need varnish, didn't need to be stored indoors over winter, and didn't rot if you left it on a beach in the rain. A family that dragged an aluminum canoe up a gravel portage trail and scratched the hull had damaged nothing that mattered. A family that dragged a cedar-strip canoe up the same trail had ruined 3 weeks of a craftsman's work. By the late 1950s, the price gap was decisive. A cedar canvas 16-footer cost roughly twice what a fiberglass equivalent sold for. The quality was incomparably higher. Any paddler who'd spent an afternoon in a Peterborough cedar strip and an afternoon in a fiberglass shell could feel the difference in the water, the way the wood flexed and responded, the particular silence of a cedar hull at speed. But quality wasn't what post-war Canada was buying. Post-war Canada was buying convenience. The cottage boom that had filled PCC's order books in the late 40s was now filling showrooms with customers who wanted boats they could leave at the dock all summer, haul out in October, and forget until May. Fiberglass gave them that. Cedar never could. The consumer shift ran deeper than material preference. The Kawarthas were no longer a paddling destination. They were a powerboating destination. The very company supplying PCC's outboard motors, OMC, across town on Monaghan Road, assembling Johnson and Evinrude engines by the thousand, was profiting from the transformation. Every Johnson Seahorse bolted to the transom of a Peterborough streamliner runabout was a small advertisement for the future that was killing the company that built the hull. The cottagers wanted speed. They wanted water skiing. They wanted to cross a lake in 10 minutes, not 40. And the boats that gave them that were increasingly made of materials that came from a factory, not a forest. The Peterborough Canoe Company saw this. The Richardsons were custodians, not fools. Through the 1940s and 50s, the product line expanded aggressively into power. Runabouts, family motorboats, water ski boats, surfboards, water skis. The Streamliner class alone offered 8 different models. The company was chasing the market that was leaving it, pivoting from paddling to motoring, from silence to horsepower, from the craft that had built the brand to the recreation that was replacing it. And in the company's final years, the pivot went further. By the time the end came, the inventory included 11 fiberglass models, 13 aluminum models, and only 4 cedar canvas canoes, along with utility boats and pop-up camper trailers. The Peterborough Canoe Company had tried, in its last desperate seasons, to become the thing that was killing it. It built fiberglass. It built aluminum. It sold trailers. The attempt tells you everything about the desperation and nothing about the timing, because the attempt came a decade too late, with a fraction of the capital that American competitors had been investing since the war. The structural problem was Canadian, and it was fatal. Tooling up for fiberglass meant buying molds, hiring chemical engineers, building curing ovens, and training a workforce whose entire identity was bound up in wood. Retooling for aluminum meant purchasing presses that cost more than the company's annual revenue. The American firms that were eating the market, Glasspar in California, Fiberstar in Ohio, Grumman on Long Island, Old Town in Maine, converting its famous wooden canoes to fiberglass, had access to venture capital, wartime manufacturing infrastructure, and consumer markets 10 times the size of Canada's. No Peterborough builder could match that. No Canadian builder of any kind was matching it. The Lakefield Canoe and Boat Company had already gone bankrupt in 1938. The surviving Lakefield operation, rebuilt under the Risher brothers in 1942, lost most of its Gordon Strickland forms in a fire in 1953. The St. Lawrence boat builders were shuttering. Penn Yan in New York and Thompson Brothers in Wisconsin were converting to fiberglass with American capital that made Canadian competitors look like hobbyists. Canadian Watercraft Limited, the holding company that controlled Peterborough, Chestnut, and the Canadian brand, had been structured for a world that no longer existed. Its value was brand reputation, accumulated over 60 years of hand-built excellence. Brand reputation didn't buy a fiberglass mold. It didn't retrain a cedar nailer. And it didn't compete with a Grumman canoe that cost half the price and lasted twice as long in the weather. The Richardsons, who had inherited a woodcraft empire and run it with the steady hand of people who believed in what they were doing, found themselves managing a company whose core competence, the thing it did better than anyone on earth, had become commercially irrelevant. The decision not to abandon wood wasn't made in a single boardroom meeting. It was made in 1,000 small choices over 15 years, each one reasonable, each one faithful to the tradition, each one a step closer to the edge. The men on the floor, the men who could feel the difference between a well-dubbed copper nail and a sloppy one, who could judge a steam-bent rib by the sound it made coming off the form. Those men would have endorsed every one of those choices. Cedar was what they knew. Cedar was what they were. And cedar, by 1960, was what was going to put them out of work. Chapter 8. The year the cluster died. The Canadian Canoe Company, the other phoenix born from the 1892 fire, the second largest survivor of the Peterborough cluster, ceased operations in October 1961. The company that Arthur Tebb and Felix Brownscombe had built on Water Street, that had been folded into Canadian Watercraft in 1928, that had carried its own brand through 6 decades of canoe building, closed its doors with a quietness that matched the town's instinct for understatement. There were no protests, no picket lines. The market had spoken, and the market had said fiberglass. Weeks later, the Peterborough Canoe Company followed. The bankruptcy was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the order books. The serial number records, the detailed production logs that would have told future historians exactly how many canoes of which model had been built in which year, were either destroyed or lost at the closure. Whether they were thrown out, whether they went into a dumpster behind the King and Water Street's factory, whether someone carried them home and they moldered in a Peterborough basement, no one knows. The company's own institutional memory vanished with the company. Decades later, the Wooden Canoe Heritage Association and the Canadian Canoe Museum would spend years reconstructing the serial number scheme from surviving canoes, original catalogs, and the oral testimony of retired builders. The books were gone. The boats, scattered across cottages and boathouses and barns from the Kawarthas to the Norfolk Broads, became the only remaining archive. Jack Richardson, the last general manager, the end of the family line that had run the company since Colonel Rogers died in 1909, presided over the end. No documented account of his state of mind on the day the factory closed has surfaced in any publicly available source. No worker interviews from the final weeks exist in any accessible archive. What survives is the shape of the thing. A man whose family had built a company over half a century, watching it declared insolvent, not because of any decision he or his predecessors had made wrong by the standards of their craft, but because the standards of their craft no longer mattered to the market that sustained them. The silence that followed the closure at King and Water Streets was not the silence of a single factory closing. It was the silence of a cluster dying. In 1930, a quarter of every Canadian employed in small boat building worked within cycling distance of that factory. By the end of 1961, that cluster was functionally extinct. 68 years of continuous production, from the first canoe off the form in the winter of 1893 to the last inventory in the autumn of '61, ended not in a catastrophe, but in an arithmetic that no amount of skill could overcome. 4,000 hand-driven copper nails could not compete with a fiberglass mold that produced a hull before lunch. But the men who had driven those nails did not accept the silence. Guy Stuart Peel was 31 years old in 1961, a PCC worker who had spent his adult life inside the King Street factory, learning the trade that was now officially dead. Before the year was out, Peel had opened Peel Marine in Lakefield, 10 kilometers north, and hired a foreman named Walter Walker. Walker was a man whose entire career mapped the geography of Peterborough boat building. He had worked at Brown's Boat Shop, then at the Peterborough Canoe Company, and now, without missing a beat, he carried his tools to Lakefield and continued building wooden boats as if the bankruptcy hadn't happened. The craft didn't care about the company's balance sheet. The craft lived in his hands. In January 1962, 2 months after PCC's closure, Jack Richardson himself re-entered the trade. The man who had been the last general manager of the company that failed established Rilco Industries Limited in Lakefield, purchasing Lakefield Boats Limited, and beginning to build cedar-strip canoes and motorboats under the Lakefield and Richardson Aquacraft trademarks. Richardson hired Walter Walker away from Peel Marine to be plant superintendent, a move that must have been a complicated conversation between two men who both understood that the world had shifted but were unwilling to stop building. More significantly, Rilco bought many of the surviving molds from the bankruptcy estates of both the Canadian Canoe Company and the Peterborough Canoe Company. The physical memory of 68 years of canoe design, the solid wood forms over which every hull had been shaped, was salvaged from the auction block by the very man whose company had just put them there. Rilco lasted 5 years and 10 months. It folded in the fall of 1967, its assets auctioned in early '68. The market that had killed PCC had not grown kinder to its successor. Walter Walker went back to Peel Marine, his third tenure at a Peterborough area boatworks, and bought 5 molds personally at the Rilco auction: a 14-foot Pioneer, a 16-foot Gordon, a 16-foot C2, a 20-foot C4, and a 30-foot War Canoe. He paid for them with his own money. He stored them himself. All 5 are now in the collection of the Canadian Canoe Museum. The building at King and Water Street stood empty for 3 years. In 1964, Outboard Marine Corporation, the parent of the Johnson and Evinrude motor brands, the company that had been PCC's engine supplier and Peterborough's other major manufacturer for 3 decades, bought the abandoned factory as a parts and service depot. The transaction was not a takeover. It was not an acquisition. It was not a corporate execution. It was a real estate purchase of a building nobody else wanted, by a company that needed warehouse space. The dramatic irony required no embellishment. The factory that had hand-built cedar canoes for 68 years was now a warehouse storing the metal cases of 2-stroke outboard motors. The craft of the paddle stored inside the house of the engine. The building didn't care. Buildings never do. In 1965, the Peterborough brand itself was sold. The buyer was the Aluminum Boats and Canoes Company of Princeville, Quebec, a firm founded in 1954 by 3 brothers named Lionel, Roger, and Sardo Barrel, operating under the trade name Princecraft. The purchase included what remained of the company's inventory: 11 fiberglass models, 13 aluminum models, 4 cedar canvas canoes, utility boats, and pop-up camper trailers. Production moved to Princeville. The name Peterborough continued to appear on aluminum and fiberglass hulls through the 1980s, stamped on boats that no craftsman from King Street would have recognized, built from materials that no cedar nailer would have touched, manufactured in a Quebec factory 600 kilometers from the Otonabee River. The link to Peterborough was severed. What remained was the name. Chapter 9. What the River Kept. The corner of King and Water Streets today is Millennium Park, a quiet strip of riverside grass with park benches, a paved path, and a view of the Otonabee that John Stevenson would still recognize. No building from the Peterborough Canoe Company complex survives. Once a year, near the end of June, antique wooden boats are displayed on the grass for National Canoe Day, a designation the city of Peterborough awarded itself with the quiet confidence of a town that knows no other city can contest the claim. The rest of the year, the park is empty. The river runs past the way it always has. The factory is a memory held by the grass. The craftsmen outlived the company by decades. Stuart Peel continued Peel Marine in Lakefield into recent years. He died in 2009 and is buried in Lakefield Cemetery, a 10-minute drive from the factory where he learned the trade. Walter Walker's 5 molds, purchased with his own wages at the Rilco auction, passed to the Canadian Canoe Museum, where they sit alongside the surviving forms from the PCC and Canadian Canoe Company bankruptcy estates. The physical templates of 68 years of design, rescued from the scrap heap by men who couldn't bear to watch them go. Cedar-strip canoe building did not die. It retreated from the factory floor to the workshop, from production to artisanship, from industry to craft. Dick Person of Buckhorn Canoe Company, working in Buckhorn, Ontario, 20 minutes from Peterborough, continues to build and restore cedar-strip canoes using techniques unchanged since Stephenson's 1883 patent. Mike Elliott of Kettle River Canoes in British Columbia has documented the construction methods in his 2024 book, This Fancy Old Canoe, preserving in print the knowledge that once passed by hand across the factory floor. Norman Betts of Miramichi Canoes in New Brunswick restores chestnuts from the sister factory in Fredericton. The skills that 4 to 7 year apprenticeships once delivered are now held by a scattered network of individual builders who work alone or in pairs, producing canoes one at a time for a market that values the material precisely because it is no longer economical. The collector market has validated what the consumer market destroyed. Restored Peterborough cedar-strip canoes and runabouts sell through Antique Boat America and specialist auction houses for the equivalent of new car prices. A museum-grade 1940 Peterborough Lakeside, a restored 1954 75th anniversary Speedster runabout, a Comfort Craft courting canoe with its original built-in phonograph. These are objects whose commercial value has increased in direct proportion to the disappearance of the skills that made them. A Peterborough canoe in 2026 is worth more than it was in 1960, for the simple reason that no factory on Earth can build another one. The Outboard Marine Corporation, the company that bought PCC's empty building in 1964, that assembled Johnson and Evinrude motors on Monaghan Road, did not escape the pattern. At its Peterborough peak, the OMC plant was the largest of its kind in Canada. 340,000 square feet of main factory, 161,000 square feet of secondary plant, plus the former PCC building, employing 2,000 workers and supplying 5,000 Canadian dealers. The plant closed in 1990. The corporate parent, OMC, headquartered in Waukegan, Illinois, declared bankruptcy on the 22nd of December, 2000, and laid off 7,000 employees. Johnson and Evinrude were bought by Bombardier in 2001. The Peterborough site left behind a documented plume of trichloroethylene and other volatile organic compounds reaching 800 meters into surrounding residential groundwater, an estimated 10,000 liters of industrial solvents, assessed by court-appointed consultants at Dillon Consulting. The engine maker that had survived the canoe maker by 39 years was itself consumed by the same force that had consumed its predecessor. The economics of somewhere else, where things could be made cheaper, faster, and further from the consequences. The building that OMC left behind became the most improbable museum in the country. Kirk Whipper was a University of Toronto physical education professor and director of Camp Candelore, near Halliburton, a man who had spent his professional life in the wilderness that Peterborough canoes were built to navigate. In 1957, a friend gave him a dugout canoe, and something in Whipper recognized the object as more than a boat. He began collecting. By the early 1990s, his Kanawha International collection of canoes, kayaks, and rowing craft had outgrown its camp buildings and needed a permanent home. Trent University professors Bruce Hodgins and John Jennings led a Peterborough rescue effort. The city wanted the collection. The collection needed a building. The building was waiting on Monaghan Road. Les Groombridge, the last CEO of OMC Canada, sold the abandoned motor factory to the nascent museum for $1. A single bill. The transaction is, by any measure, the most perfectly ironic real estate transfer in Canadian industrial history. A building constructed to assemble the outboard motors that had displaced paddling on the Kawartha Lakes was sold for a token to house the world's largest collection of paddled watercraft. Over 600 canoes and kayaks, including Walter Walker's 5 molds, including birch bark canoes built by the ancestors of the people whose design John Stephenson had watched and copied in 1857. The Canadian Canoe Museum opened to the public on Canada Day, 1997, in that former engine factory. It stayed there for 25 years. In September 2022, the collection was moved to a new purpose-built lakeside building on Ashburnham Drive, designed by lead architects at a final construction cost of $45 million. The new museum opened on the 11th of May, 2024, beside the Peterborough lift lock on the Trent-Severn Waterway, paddling distance from where Stephenson sat on the shore of Little Lake in 1857. It is the first mainstream Canadian museum with signage in English, French, and Anishinaabe, the language of the Mississauga people whose canoe design started everything. The city that surrounds it has changed as thoroughly as the factory floor. Peterborough's industrial base has collapsed across the board. General Electric, which arrived as Edison Electric in 1891 and was the city's largest employer for most of the 20th century, has contracted. Quaker Oats, Westclocks, Fisher Gage, the names that once gave the town its manufacturing identity alongside the canoe makers, have closed or diminished. At the manufacturing peak in the 1950s and 60s, Peterborough had 54 trade unions. Today, the Regional Hospital, Trent University, and Sir Sandford Fleming College are the largest employers. The Canoe Company's closure in 1961 wasn't an industrial catastrophe for Peterborough. It was a cultural one, the loss of the thing that gave the town a name the rest of the world recognized. Chapter 10. The Silence on Little Lake. The Peterborough Canoe Company was not killed by a villain. It was not killed by OMC, a company that had been its engine supplier for 33 years and bought its empty building 3 years after the bankruptcy. It was not killed by corporate greed or boardroom malice or the kind of concentrated recklessness that makes a satisfying documentary accusation. It was killed by physics. Cedar and copper nails could not compete with fiberglass and rivets, a craft that required a 4-year apprenticeship and 4,000 hand-driven fasteners per hull, could not compete with a mold that produced a finished shell before the lunch whistle. A family-run trust with no research and development budget could not compete with American manufacturers backed by wartime industrial infrastructure and consumer markets 10 times the size of the Canadian one. The calculation was simple, and it was merciless, and every wooden boat builder in central Ontario arrived at the same answer within the same decade. The men who built the boats knew the answer before the accountants did. They could feel it in the thinning order books, in the shift from canoes to runabouts, in the fiberglass models that appeared in the catalog like uninvited guests. They drove their copper nails anyway. They varnished their hulls anyway. Walter Walker carried his tools from Brown to Peterborough, to Rilco, to Peel, and never stopped building. Because the alternative, to accept that the thing his hands could do better than anyone's was no longer worth doing, was a conclusion he refused to reach. The factory at King and Water Streets is grass now. The engine plant on Monaghan Road housed a canoe museum for 25 years. The building that motorized the Kawarthas turned into the cathedral of paddling. The new museum sits on Little Lake, beside the lift lock, with signage in the language of the people whose canoe started all of it. And in workshops scattered across Ontario and New Brunswick and British Columbia, a handful of builders still steam bend ribs over solid forms, still drive copper nails with cobbler's hammers, still apply 6 coats of spar varnish to interiors that glow with the amber warmth of something no factory will ever produce again. The Otonabee still runs past the place where the factory stood. It runs quieter now. The sawdust is gone. The salmon never came back. The cedar still grows in the Kawartha cuts to the north, and every autumn it drops its scale leaves into water that carries them south, past Millennium Park, past the empty corner where Colonel Rogers rebuilt from ashes and the Richardsons built an empire, and the craftsmen drove 4,000 nails into each hull with a patience that the 20th century could not afford, and the 21st will not replicate. The wide board, the copper nail, the smell of cedar in a room where men in white shirts bent over a form and built by hand the most beautiful boats the country ever made. The river keeps it. The river is the only thing that does.